Most parents who contact me are willing to walk over hot coals in order to have a reconciliation with their adult child, because often not only is the adult child part of the consequence, but also a loss of grandchildren. Grandchildren are typically a package deal with the adult child. So if the adult child cuts off contact, even with parents who they acknowledge were loving, dedicated grandparents, now their grandchildren are out of the equation, which is just another layer of guilt and shame and more just loss for the grandparent, or the fear that, well, what are my grandchildren hearing? What are they thinking? Do they think I don't love them, that I don't care about them? So this, again, is another enormous source of suffering that is largely still hidden in our society and has to become more visible.
Hello, and welcome to Not Born Yesterday, a podcast dedicated to older adults and the challenges and joys of aging. I'm Miriam Goodman.
Not Born Yesterday is brought to you by Next Village SF, a local nonprofit providing older adults in the Northeast neighborhood of San Francisco with support to help age in place. I'm Lynn Winter-Gross.
Today on Not Born Yesterday, we're discussing what some therapists and researchers are calling a silent epidemic, estrangement between adult children and their parents. Though rarely talked about because of guilt, shame, and blame, estrangement is one of the most painful experiences for parents and their adult children, no matter how it began. According to our guest, the reasons for estrangement are complex and varied and more widespread than you think. Dr. Joshua Coleman is a psychologist and author who helps parents navigate the hurt, guilt, and sorrow that comes with being shut out of the lives of adult children and grandchildren. He assists parents to better understand the mindset of their adult children and teaches them to implement strategies for reconciliation and healing. Dr. Coleman's book, Rules of Estrangement: Why Adult Children Cut Ties and How to Heal the Conflict, is a guide for parents whose adult children have cut off contact and reveals the hidden logic of estrangement, explores its cultural causes, and offers practical advice to those to reestablish contact. Dr. Coleman, welcome to Not Born Yesterday.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, I want to say that Leo Tolstoy wrote that all happy families are alike and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So how alike and different are the unhappy families you're dealing with?
Well, they're alike, at least in regards to parental estrangement. It's typically the parents that are contacting me because they're often in more pain, and for them, there's no upside. From the adult child's perspective, there may be lots of upside to cutting off the parent. And if you go on the adult child's forums, like at Reddit or Strange Adult Children, you often see things like, oh, best thing I ever did, done with the stress, don't need the drama, good for my mental health. And for the parents, you see really the opposite. You just see unremitting sorrow, guilt, regret, sadness, even suicidal feelings. So there are these very different psychological states that attends both sides of the family. So in regards to Tolstoy's statement or observation, one of the ways to think about it is that there are many pathways to estrangement. One of the reasons it's a silent epidemic and people don't know more about it or hear more about it is that parents have a lot of shame about it. And they also fear that if they talk about it, that people are going to say, well, you must have done something pretty terrible, because adult children don't just cut off contact parents for no reason. And, in fact, some parents have been abusive or neglectful, or they continue to be shaming and rejecting and critical in ways that the adult child may feel like, well, I have to choose my own mental well-being over time with my parents. But that's not the only pathway to estrangement. Another one happens when the adult child marries somebody and they marry somebody who doesn't like the parent or the parents. And they say to the parent, they say to their spouse, choose them or me. You can't have both. It's what I call the cult of one. Or the adult child has mental illness issues that don't come from having a dysfunctional family, from genetic reasons or other kinds of circumstances or environmental conditions. Or they don't know any other way to feel separate from the parent than to reject them. Or they get into therapy, a big problem today, and the therapist makes a big deal out about childhood experiences that may not have been nearly as formative or as important as the therapist is alleging them to be. And the therapist either encourages or supports an estrangement, or even more profoundly, the parent gets divorced at any age, And in my experience and in my research, divorce is a very common pathway to estrangement for a variety of reasons. So they're different in that sense.
Is this something new with this generation? Are there cultural differences? Are there generational differences?
Well, we assume that there's always been some estrangements. I would argue that estrangements are on the rise for a variety of reasons. One of the things that I talk about in an Atlantic article that I wrote a few years ago is the way the moral framework has changed radically in the past half century, from the idea that honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, families forever, to a much more personal, growth-oriented, identity-focused perspective. So today, nothing compels an adult child to have a relationship with that parent beyond whether or not that adult child wants that relationship with that parent. And so that means parents have to work much harder to maintain the tie. They have to be much more psychological, more aware of their communications, much more respectful of the child's boundaries, because the child is more willing to walk. So while there may have always been estrangements, never before have they been considered an expression of personal growth and the pursuit of happiness and well-being. But to circle back to your other question, Lynn, about cultural differences, yes, this in general, I see this much more with white Euro-American families, far less with Latino, African-American families, some Asian families. But again, the majority of people in my practice tend to be more Euro-American white families. And similarly, there's probably whole continents where estrangement doesn't even exist, or countries where it's still considered just they don't even have a word for it, basically.
You mentioned that for the parent, there really is no upside. So does that mean parents have to be the ones to make the first move towards reconciliation? You gave an example in your book of a man who said, well, why should I apologize to my son? I may have been hard on him, but I was trying to make him into a real man and he wasn't. So is that the way it usually happens?
It's almost always the parent who has to make the initiative, because for the adult child, and the surveys of adult children who are estranged show this as well, for them, they feel like it's working for them. They feel like, well, I tried and now I feel better, or, just my life is less complicated, etc. Whereas for the parent, it's all downside. So if anybody's going to make the move, it has to be on the parent's side. Now, parents aren't morally obligated to do it, although I would say that parents are morally obligated to at least try to understand what their children are thinking and feeling and to reach out to them. But I also think that adult children are morally obligated to show empathy for their parent and really accept that the parent did the best that they could. And they may not have the kind of psychological tools to empathize with what the adult child is experiencing, either in the present or the past, and that should be factored into the equation. But in general, reconciliations don't happen unless the parent makes the first move. And that's just a reality that some parents are either willing to accept or not. Most parents who contact me are willing to walk over hot coals in order to have a reconciliation with their adult child, because often not only is the adult child part of the consequence, but also a loss of grandchildren. There's often grandchildren are typically a package deal with the adult child. So if the adult child cuts off contact, even with parents who they acknowledge were loving, dedicated grandparents, now their grandchildren are out of the equation, which is just another layer of guilt and shame, and more just loss for the grandparent, or the fear that, well, what are my grandchildren hearing? What are they thinking? Do they think I don't love them, that I don't care about them? So this, again, is another enormous source of suffering that is largely still hidden in our society and has to become more visible.
You talk about the parents taking the first step. What are the first steps?
The first steps are to show empathy, to take responsibility, to find the kernel of truth in the child's complaints, if not the bushel of truth, to not guilt trip, not criticize. It's really very much an expression of empathy and a desire to understand. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about the way that the relationship has become much more psychologically intensive. From the adult child's perspective, the relationship has to be predicated on the principles of self-growth and mental health and happiness. And so the language that the parent uses has to be respectful of those ideals. And it also has to be respectful of the child's boundaries, because the child has so much power to walk, basically.
How would you describe what you call reunification therapy?
Right. Well, reunification therapy is if I'm lucky enough to get the adult child to agree, then the goal of the therapy is to help the parent understand why the adult child has decided that it's in their best interest to not be in contact, what the parent needs to do to show that they can change or have a relationship more in line with that adult child's boundaries or needs. Often means that the parent has to be able to empathize with what that adult child's experience either in childhood or as an adult, to have the parent take responsibility. And what I often tell parents going into reconciliation therapy is this is a marriage therapy. This isn't a situation where you're going to have an equal say over how the therapy turns out. In marriage therapy, you both come in, you both have kind of an equal say, you kind of meet somewhere in the middle. With reconciliation therapy, it's more like a divorce where the person has walked and they're willing to give the marriage one more try, but it's going to be on their terms. So it's just basic game theory that the person who cares the least has the most power. And so it's not going to be on this, the parent doesn't really get to say how unfair they feel like it is or what their rules are for going forward, at least initially. If the therapy goes on for some period of time, then there's more room for the parent to talk about their perspective. But early in reconciliation therapy, there's not a lot of room for the parent to talk about this. And that may feel unfair, but those are sort of the rules of re-engagement.
You've written about amends letter, the amends letter. What is that?
I think the amends letter is the single most important thing that a parent can do to get on the steps towards reconciliation. And my research shows that as well. The amends letter is really just saying to the adult child, look, you clearly have reasons for cutting off contact with me. You wouldn't have done this unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do. Now, from the parent's perspective, it may not be the healthiest thing for the adult child to do. But from the parent's perspective, from the adult child's perspective, it is. And that's a way to get on the same page as the adult child. And I've had many letters from parents saying that letter was the single thing that opened the door, the parent acknowledging that the adult child must have reasons for it. So it's approaching it not from the perspective of guilt or shame. I know when the three of us were growing up, there was room for a mother, particularly a Jewish mother, to go, what? You can't call your mother more often? I'm going to sit here alone, Mr. Fancy Psychologist out in San Francisco. Too good to call your poor mother back in Dayton, Ohio. So, there was room for that and for it to be an act of affection. But that ship has largely sailed. Now a parent guilt tripping their adult child is considered a form of emotional abuse or emotional incest or some other ridiculous term from self-help or my field of psychology. So parents have to really not use any of that kind of negative influence if their goal is a reconciliation.
Well, you just talked a little bit earlier about cultural changes, and it seems to me that perhaps our grandparents never talked back to their parents, never talked about self-fulfillment, things like that. And now that's common. You see it at the playground, you see it at children's sports activities. Kids and parents, not just the ones who think, oh, my father's my best friend, but the I don't know if I want to call it respect, or the lines of authority are blurred. Let's put it that way. So is it natural that there would be this estrangement that comes out of that kind of upbringing?
Well, I think so. I think there's a good news, bad news here. The good news is that the majority of parents today, at least according to some polls, say that more parents feel closer to their adult children than they believe their parents felt to them at a similar age. So I think that those of us who have been parenting in this much more psychological, sensitive, empathic, self-esteem building way, if we're lucky, we have close relationships with our children in part because of that. Some adult children are moving back with their parents, not only out of financial need, but in part because they like their parents. The bad news is that, to your point, Mimsy, the lines of authority have changed so that the whole idea of honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, has been supplanted by this much more psychological, egalitarian, democratic view of family that we've been engaged in for the past half century. And that means if a kid wants to walk, then they can walk. And not only that, there's enormous social support to do so.
Don't they feel any guilt, these children that walk?
I think they do. I think they feel guilt, and I think they feel some degree of shame as well. And if you look at the research from the adult child, they do feel conflict. Most of them will say that they felt like it was what they had to do, or it was the measure of last resort. But not all of them feel that way. But I think there is a certain amount of conflict, which is why I don't encourage parents to play on that. In the olden days, we could play on our children's guilt as a motivator, but again, that ship has sailed, and so it has to be much more about the relationship and developing the relationship, which I think is a sea change in family relationships.
You talked about one of the steps of reconciliation, the amends letter. What else do you suggest that parents do?
So one of the things that sometimes happens is that it's better to just not do anything. So I tell parents to completely let the line go cold, at least for a year, if they're getting restraining orders sent out or getting threats to call their attorney, or being told to only talk to the attorney, or every time they reach out to the adult child, they get some super hostile message back, or letters to the adult child or the grandchildren are sent back, return to sender. Just don't do anything. Let the line go completely cold for a year. Don't send any gifts, any letters. It just means things are way too heated for any good to come. Then after a year, you can say, look, I'm just checking in with you. I know that my reaching out before wasn't helpful. I wanted to see if you have had any, if you might be open to talking. I'm happy to if you're open to doing family therapy with me, I would welcome that. If the things you want me to work on in my own therapy, I'm open to that. So that's important. Often the things that sometimes just sending maybe a monthly text just to sort of show that you're open and available, and you're not mad, or you're not in a punitive state of mind, and that kind of thing. Something chatty, et cetera. I think typically one amends letter with maybe a follow-up 6 to 8 weeks later is as much as any parent should do. I don't think you need to be in a position of contrition for the rest of your life. Just one solid amends letter to kind of show that you're willing to take responsibility and have a different kind of a relationship. I think those are the main things. A lot of the best things to do are not to do the wrong things to do. I have a webinar. I do weekly webinars for estranged parents, and one of them is called the 5 Most Common Mistakes of Estranged Parents. And the first most common mistakes is thinking about what's fair versus what's strategic. What's fair is that your adult child would know that you actually were a good parent, or you did a lot for them, or you did things for them better than your own parents did. Or that whatever mistakes you made, there was good reasons for them, et cetera. But that's not going to work. What's strategic is to do some of the other things that I've talked about. The second common mistake is to use guilt, as I've talked about. The third is to return fire with fire, meaning your kid sends back some hostile email and you send back something equally hostile. I think a lot of therapists today make the mistake of saying, well, you need to stand up to your child and, tell them X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, no, you don't need to do that. Not if your goal is reconciliation. A fourth is just not knowing how long estrangements can take to reconcile, because they typically do take time. And the fifth is to assume that it's all about you. By the time we have adult children, particularly grandchildren, they're really front and center of our minds and heart and consciousness. We're not front and center of their minds and heart and consciousness. I mean, I was fortunate to have parents that I really liked, but I always knew when I visited them or called them that it was much more important to them and more meaningful to them than it was to me. I mean, it was meaningful and important to me, but I knew it was much more important to them. And I assume the same is true with my adult children as well. So not personalizing the fact that they don't return your call right away or your text. In some ways, it's not our fault, but family relationships have been burdened by how easy it is for us all to stay in touch with each other, and how rejected we can feel if we don't get the text back or the email back or whatever. So those things can really compromise and challenge relationships.
I assume technology plays a role here. It's so easy to send an email and a text and wait for the response, which is a little different than leaving a phone message.
Well, right. I mean, I think that a lot of estrangements happen because the adult child just feels too crowded psychologically by the parent. And if there was any word that I see in every single letter I review from the adult child, or every conversation I have with them, is, you need to respect my boundaries. That is the single most common thing that I hear. And part of that is because of email and texting and cell phones. So a certain percentage of estrangements, I think, would never have occurred if the adult child could just sort of organically have grown up without being in so much contact with the parent, but it also speaks to the way that we have become much more surveilling and intense in the past half century or so. We've all become helicopter parents, in part because it's the only way that we could get our children through the narrow bottleneck into a potential adulthood. And, when it works well, it works really well. But when it works badly, some adult children just have felt way too crowded, way too enmeshed. They don't know any other way to feel separate from the parent than to cut the parent off. I've heard more than one daughter say of her mother, I just need to cut her off so I can get her voice out of my head. So, and it's not because the mother was abusive, it's because she was more anxious or involved or caretaking and the like. So it's the downside of love. They may say it's, oh, the parent was narcissistic or whatever, but it's really it's just the downside of love and involvement that could be problematic.
Well, at what point do you advise a parent or an adult child to actually give up on reconciling?
Well, for the parent, I've hopefully said that in terms of the where you would give up for, you just let the line go cold. I think if an adult child's fully grown and you've been trying for several years and nothing's happening, it may be better for you to just stop trying, because it may cause a child to feel like you're respecting their needs more, even if you don't understand them or don't agree with them. It may cause them to miss you more. That old saying, how can I miss you if you never go away, is sometimes true. They may respect you more, that you're not continuing to throw good energy after bad. From the adult child's side, while I'm not in favor of estrangement, I do think if there are some parents who are so unrepentant, so critical, so shaming, so humiliating, that the adult child doesn't know any other way to construct a happy life than to either cut off the parent or limit contact. I just wish that those adult children would give their parents ample warning and ample time to repair, but also ample empathy and compassion, that the parent just may not have the tools to communicate or understand in ways, and needs to be given time and help to do so.
Do you have any advice for families dealing with mourning and the loss of the relationship if they can't reconcile?
Yeah, it's probably the most common thing, that the question that I get asked. And I think one of the most powerful principles is this notion of radical acceptance, which is that sometimes we just have to accept the things that we have no control over. And this is harder for mothers than for fathers. Fathers are more common. Fathers more often say something like, well, screw that kid, they can come apologize to me. I'm not going to apologize to them. Whereas mothers feel like, well, there must be something I can do. They feel like they're being bad mothers if they're not continuing to reach out and to try to empathize, to show compassion. But sometimes, at some point, that isn't very useful. It's not only not useful to the potential reconciliation, but it's actually harmful to not just accept that you may not be able to fix this either now or forevermore. And in doing so, there's a saying, pain plus struggle equals suffering. Sometimes the things that we fight the most to not feel, or that we feel the most upset about, we actually are increasing those feelings the more that we can just sort of allow it and accept it. And sometimes that kind of practice is best done through mindfulness or other forms where we're really practicing staying in the present moment is the most important thing. But the other part is getting adequate social support. I have a private Facebook group for estranged parents and grandparents, which people can reach through my website. They just click on the Facebook icon. Just make sure you answer all the questions, because we screen to make sure that it's parents and not adult children who are wandering onto the site. Being able to talk to other estranged parents is hugely therapeutic, because it's such a socially isolating phenomenon.
Dr. Coleman, is there anything that we've missed that you'd like to add?
Well, I just want to highlight the problematic role of therapy today in as being a kind of an enabler of estrangements. That too many therapists are so oriented towards the well-being of their individual client, in this case, the adult child. They're pathologizing what I would say are normal, expectable feelings of guilt and feelings of responsibility and caretaking for the parent. And they're calling it codependency, or they're saying that the parent is gaslighting them if they don't immediately endorse their perspective. And I think that that's a problem. I think that my field has done harm in perpetuating or greenlighting estrangements by overly endorsing what I think are healthy feelings of guilt or worry or feelings of responsibility to the parent.
Thank you so much for this painful but necessary conversation. That was Dr. Joshua Coleman, author of Rules of Estrangement.
news you can use, we want to share some information about medical results. While modern medicine and the internet have changed the doctor-patient relationship, the downside is that many of us find that the only way we can communicate with our doctor or nurse is online. Instead of just talking to a human, we now use an online portal to ask questions or make appointments. And frequently, before we even hear from our medical professional, we receive test results and lab analyses on the portal that we may not understand.
For example, results from our blood work. Often we don't understand either the numbers or the medical lingo. More disturbing, these portals feature test results that are laced with jargon impenetrable to a layperson. While the ability to track an ongoing condition can be useful, if we're dealing with a new or unidentified condition like results from a mammogram, we may find ourselves in needless distress. We see these results due to a provision in the 21st Century Cures Act, which requires the prompt release of test results to patients. At many hospitals and healthcare systems, test results are put into patient records the day they come back from the lab.
So here's some helpful advice. If you're not a medical professional, don't try to interpret the lab results yourself. Also, don't go on the internet searching for information on lab tests because you don't know if what you find applies to your condition. Otherwise, before you know it, you'll turn up information that will scare the living daylights out of you. Instead, speak to your physician to discuss your test results. This way, you'll learn more about identifying terminology in your record and become a much more informed patient. Write down a list of critical questions before your conversation. If any terminology feels intimidating, don't worry about admitting it and asking your doctor to provide clarity.
For example, you could ask, do my test results fall into the normal range? What treatment do my results indicate? Do my results suggest improvement or decline in my existing condition? Do I need a follow-up or should I retake the test in a few months? If you find anything that still confuses you, speak up. It's never wrong to ask for help regarding something as important as your health. And that's our podcast for today. Our thanks go to Dr. Joshua Coleman, author of Rules of Estrangement. You can learn more about Next Village SF at their website, nextvillagesf.org. Our theme music is from Hook Sounds, and Jason Dahlstedt is our engineer. And thank you for listening. We'd love to hear what you would like us to discuss and discover. Please contact us at notbornyesterdaypodcast.org. Be well, stay strong, and remember, you weren't born yesterday. I'm Lynn Winter Gross.
And I'm Miriam Goodman.